At 3:43 a.m. on Dead Horse Ridge near Missoula, Atlas started growling at a crack in the frozen rock while warm air breathed out of the mountain. Mason reached for his flashlight fast, too fast. Then the dog backed away like he recognized something underground. What would make a military dog afraid to move closer? Comment below. At 11:20 a.m., the copier jammed again inside Howard and Kemp attorneys at law. The sharp, clicking sound echoed through the little reception office near West Broadway, followed by a burst of static from the old machine. Somebody in the back muttered a curse under their breath. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly like trapped insects. Mason Reed stopped moving for half a second, not long enough for anyone else to notice. But Atlas noticed. The German shepherd lifted his head from beneath Mason's chair, amber eyes locking onto him instantly. One ear twitched forward, waiting. Mason's hand had already tightened around the edge of the folder in front of him before he realized what he was doing. Kandahar AO. Different sound, different year, still close enough. He loosened his grip slowly and rubbed his thumb against the scar near his wedding finger, though there hadn't been a ring there in a very long time. Across the conference table, Travis Reed leaned back in his chair with the heavy confidence of a man who had spent his entire life standing on land that already belonged to him. At 53, Travis still had the thick shoulders of a rancher. His denim jacket smelled faintly of hay and diesel fuel. Beside him sat Cole Branner in a charcoal sport coat that probably cost more than Mason's truck. Cole crossed one polished boot over the other and checked his phone while Howard Kemp sorted papers near the window. Outside, Missoula moved through a gray late October morning. A city bus hissed to a stop near the courthouse steps. Wind dragged yellow leaves along the sidewalk outside like dry paper. Howard cleared his throat. Your father's estate has been divided according to the final notarized amendment, filed March 14th. Nobody spoke. The old lawyer adjusted his glasses and looked toward Travis first. The main Reed Ranch property transfers it entirely to Travis Reed, including livestock rights and structures along Blue Mountain Road. Travis nodded once, expected. Howard slid another folder across the table. Cole Branner receives the commercial parcels adjacent to Reserve Street and the undeveloped acreage near Frenchtown. Cole smiled without showing teeth. Appreciate it. Mason said nothing. Atlas rested his chin back on Mason's boot, though the dog's eyes stayed open. Howard hesitated before reaching for the final document. And to Mason Reed, the lawyer paused again. Something about it felt deliberate. Your father left parcel 18, commonly referred to as Dead Horse Ridge, 30 acres northwest of Lolo National Forest, including all recorded subsurface access rights. Atlas's head came up immediately, not slowly, instantly. The dog stared toward Howard with sudden focus, ears rigid now. Cole blinked once before a short laugh escaped him. Jesus, he muttered. 30 acres of wind and broken rock. Travis rubbed a hand across his jaw and looked toward Mason. At least property taxes are cheap up there. Howard didn't smile. He slid a paper across the table toward Mason instead. Past due amount, 4217.83C. Mason looked at the number without reacting. The paper smelled faintly of toner ink and old cardboard. $4,000 might as well have been 40. Outside the window, a pickup rolled through slush near the courthouse intersection. The tires hissed softly over wet pavement. Cole leaned back farther in his chair. I'm serious, though. That ridge is worthless. Nobody's built up there since the 70s. Wind tears through that whole slope year-round. Mason finally looked up. Maybe. That was all he said. Cole gave a little shrug. Hell, if taxes get too ugly, I'll buy it off you. Save you the headache. Atlas let out a low sound in his chest. Not a growl exactly, a warning. Cole noticed it and lifted both hands slightly. Easy there, Cujo. Mason placed one hand lightly against Atlas's neck. The dog settled immediately. That got Travis's attention more than the conversation had. You still keeping him with you full time? Mason nodded. He sleeps better than I do. Nobody answered that. Howard shuffled another document quietly while the room settled into an awkward silence. Somewhere deeper in the office, the copier jammed again, with another hard metallic snap. Mason's shoulders tightened before he could stop them. He hated that. Hated how sounds still reached him before logic did. A slammed tailgate, a dropped wrench, helicopter rotors overhead. The body remembered first, the mind caught up later. Howard pretended not to notice. Maybe he really didn't. Or maybe old lawyers learned how to leave wounded things alone. The meeting dragged another 20 minutes through signatures and county transfer forms. Mason signed where they pointed. His handwriting looked steadier than he felt. When it ended, Travis stood first. You staying in town a while? A day or two. You still in that Silverado? Mason nodded once. Travis exhaled through his nose like he wanted to say something else, but decided against it. The brothers had once known how to talk to each other. Back before deployments, before funerals, before their father stopped speaking unless necessary. Now most conversations felt like stepping around broken glass in the dark. Cole tucked his phone into his jacket pocket and stood. If you decide to sell that ridge, call me before you call anyone else. Mason looked at him. Why? Cole smiled thinly. Because even worthless land becomes useful eventually. That lingered in the room a second too long. Then he left. The front office bell jingled softly as the door shut behind him. Atlas watched the door until the sound of Cole's footsteps disappeared outside. Only then did the dog relax. Howard began gathering papers into neat stacks while Travis headed toward the hallway. I'll be out front, Travis said. Need coffee. The door closed behind him. Now it was quiet, just the fluorescent hum. Traffic outside, the faint smell of old legal pads and burnt coffee. Howard Kemp removed his glasses slowly. For the first time that morning, he looked directly at Mason instead of through paperwork. Your father came here alone 3 weeks before he died. Mason stayed still. Howard opened one desk drawer and removed a small brass key attached to a faded red tag. No label, no markings. Just worn metal polished smooth by years in somebody's pocket. He told me to give you this privately. Mason frowned slightly. What is it? Howard handed him the key. No idea. The brass felt cold against Mason's palm. Howard lowered his voice. He also said something else. Mason waited. The old lawyer glanced once toward the closed hallway before speaking. He said you'd know where to use it. Outside, a siren wailed faintly, somewhere near Higgins Avenue before fading into the wind. Mason looked down at the key again. Atlas rose quietly beside his chair. The dog stared at the brass key the same way he'd stared when Howard mentioned subsurface rights. Alert, focused, like he recognized something Mason didn't. Howard slid one final envelope across the desk. Inside was an old survey map of Dead Horse Ridge. Most of it showed nothing but contour lines, rock elevation marks, and faded county stamps from 1978. But near the eastern slope, somebody had drawn a tiny circle in blue ink. No label, just a mark. Mason stared at it for a long moment. Then he folded the map carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Outside the office, cold Montana wind rolled down the street hard enough to rattle the courthouse flagpole. Travis stood near the curb, holding 2 coffees from Clyde Coffee on Broadway. Steam drifted upward into the gray air. You coming? He asked. Mason looked west toward the distant mountains beyond town. Clouds hung low over the Bitterroot Range. Somewhere out there sat 30 acres nobody wanted. Wind, rock, debt, and apparently a key. Atlas pressed close against Mason's leg as they stepped onto the sidewalk. The dog's ears stayed pointed toward the mountains, like something up there was already waiting for them. By 1:18 p.m., Mason was heading south on Highway 93, with Atlas stretched across the back seat of the Silverado. The truck heater barely worked unless the engine stayed above 50 miles an hour, so cold air still leaked through the vents in thin streams that smelled faintly of rust and old antifreeze. The brass key sat in the cup holder beside a half-empty gas station coffee. Every now and then Mason glanced at it without meaning to. Traffic thinned past Reserve Street. Then the city slowly gave way to pine, rock, and long stretches of open Montana, land washed gray beneath a low sky. Snow already dusted the higher ridges west of the valley. Winter was moving down early this year. A text buzzed once on Mason's cracked phone screen near the Y interchange. "Travis, you got enough gas money to get back?" Mason looked at it a while before locking the screen again. He didn't answer. Atlas shifted in the back seat as they passed a logging truck hauling fresh-cut timber north toward Missoula. The chains rattled against steel, hard enough to echo through the cab. Mason's shoulders tightened instantly. Not now. He lowered one window an inch despite the cold and let fresh air cut through the truck. Pine sap, wet asphalt, wood smoke drifting from somewhere deeper in the valley. Better. The Silverado's odometer rolled past 287,441 miles just outside Lolo. A faded sign for Travelers Rest State Park flashed by on the right. Then civilization started thinning fast. Mason turned west onto a narrow Forest Service access road marked with an old green sign half covered in bullet holes. Road 614, seasonal access. Mud sucked softly at the truck tires as the road climbed higher into broken timberland. Snow lingered in shaded ditches where sunlight no longer reached. Atlas stood up now, alert. His claws clicked against the truck bed liner while he stared through the windshield. "You smell something?" The dog's ears twitched once. Mason drove another 2 miles before the road narrowed enough that branches scraped both sides of the Silverado. Dead pine needles dragged across the windows with dry, whispering sounds. At 2:42 p.m., he finally saw it. Dead Horse Ridge. The place looked worse than he expected. Dark basalt shelves jutted from the mountainside like broken teeth. Wind bent the scattered lodgepole pines sideways along the ridgeline. There wasn't a fence, not a cabin, not even old utility poles. Just black rock and open sky. Cole hadn't lied about that part. Mason parked beside the remains of an old fire road washed out by runoff years ago. The Silverado settled unevenly as one rear tire sank slightly into frozen mud. The engine ticked softly after he shut it off. Silence followed. Not true silence. Montana silence. Wind through timber. A raven somewhere overhead. Branches creaking far uphill. Atlas jumped down first and immediately began circling the perimeter in widening loops. Nose low, tail stiff but level, working. Mason grabbed his old canvas duffel from the truck bed and slung it over one shoulder. The movement pulled slightly at old scar tissue near his ribs where shrapnel had once entered and exited clean enough for him to survive, but ugly enough to leave reminders every winter. Cold air bit through his flannel instantly. He stood there a while studying the ridge. There were signs somebody had once tried to use the land decades ago. Half-buried fence posts, rusted cable near a collapsed culvert, one warped metal barrel tucked against a rock shelf. Nothing recent. The place felt abandoned in a final kind of way. Atlas barked once uphill. Short, sharp. Mason followed him about 30 yards through scattered pine and volcanic rock until he found a relatively flat section protected from the worst crosswind by a jagged basalt wall. Good enough. He dropped the duffel and got to work without wasting motion. Tarp first, then paracord, then anchor points. His hand still remembered knots faster than his mind did. Years in the Rangers had burned certain movements too deep to lose completely. Even after all this time, the green tarp snapped violently in the wind while he secured one corner against a deadfall log. Atlas paced constantly during setup, occasionally stopping to stare east along the ridge, watching. Mason noticed scratches on the dog's muzzle from pushing through thick brush earlier. "You find bears already?" Atlas ignored him. By 4:06 p.m., camp was standing. Barely. The tarp lean-to sat low against the basalt wall, with just enough room underneath for a folding cot, a propane stove, and Mason's gear. Not comfortable, but survivable for a few nights. Maybe longer if weather held. He crouched beside the small stove and heated a can of beef stew while daylight faded over the Bitterroot Valley. Steam curled upward into the cold air, carrying the smell of salt and canned onions. Atlas finally settled nearby, but kept lifting his head every few seconds, still listening. Mason ate slowly from the dented metal can itself, one spoonful at a time, the way he had overseas when meals were more about calories than enjoyment. Wind hit the tarp hard enough to shake the entire shelter. The sound dragged something old loose in his head. Canvas snapping, rotor wash, men yelling over gunfire. For half a second, he was back inside a temporary outpost outside Kandahar, watching dust explode sideways across HESCO barriers, while somebody screamed for a medic through radio static. Then Atlas nudged his arm sharply with his nose. Mason blinked. The ridge returned. Cold air, dark trees, Montana. He exhaled slowly and rubbed one hand over the dog's neck. "Yeah," he muttered quietly. "I'm here." Night settled fast after sunset. By 7:11 p.m., the temperature had dropped to 27 degrees, according to the cheap digital thermometer clipped to Mason's pack. Frost already coated the Silverado windows downhill. He rolled himself inside an old military poncho liner on the cot, while Atlas lay across the tarp entrance facing outward, always outward. The dog never slept facing inward anymore. Neither did Mason. Wind hammered the ridge steadily for hours. Sometimes it moaned through the basalt shelves, almost like distant voices. Other times it shrieked sharp enough to sound mechanical. At 3:43 a.m., Mason woke instantly with his flashlight already in hand. No hesitation, no confusion. 1 second asleep, next second, breathing hard with the beam sweeping the darkness. The tarp snapped violently overhead again. Atlas was already standing. The dog moved beyond the shelter entrance and stared uphill into darkness, thick enough to swallow the flashlight beam after 20 feet. Mason listened. Nothing at first. Then something else beneath the wind, a low, hollow sound, almost like air moving through a pipe somewhere underground. Atlas began walking, not wandering, tracking. Mason shoved his boots on and followed him through scattered frost-covered brush, illuminated only by the flashlight beam bouncing across volcanic stone. The dog led him nearly 60 yards east before stopping beside a cluster of fractured basalt near the ridgeline. Atlas froze there, completely still. Mason stepped closer. Wind tore across the ridge hard enough to sting his face, but something about this spot felt different immediately. Subtle, strange. He crouched beside the rock formation and held one bare hand near a narrow crack between two basalt shelves. Warm air touched his skin. Not hot, just warmer than the freezing mountain wind surrounding it. Mason frowned. Atlas stared directly at the crack now, ears rigid forward. The opening itself was narrow, maybe 16 inches wide at most, mostly hidden behind dead brush and shadow. Easy to miss, impossible to notice from downhill. Mason swept the flashlight beam across it carefully. The rock inside disappeared downward instead of inward, deep, very deep. Then the flashlight caught something metallic wedged between stone farther below. For just a second, Mason leaned closer. The brass key inside his jacket pocket suddenly felt heavier than before. Behind him, the ridge groaned beneath another blast of wind. Atlas didn't move. Neither did Mason. Because somewhere below those rocks, warm air was breathing steadily out of the mountain. And for the first time all day, Dead Horse Ridge no longer felt empty. Mason barely slept after that. By 5:36 a.m., pale blue light had started creeping over the ridge, and he was already crouched beside the crack again, with a thermos of burnt coffee balanced on the rock beside him. Frost covered the basalt like powdered glass. Every breath drifted white into the morning air. Atlas stood uphill, facing the tree line, watching security. The The dog had done that since Afghanistan. Even now, years later, Atlas always positioned himself where he could see the widest approach angle. Never relaxed completely, never fully off duty. Mason reached one gloved hand toward the narrow opening again. Warm, still there, not imagination, not trapped sunlight from yesterday, real airflow. He pulled the folded survey map from his jacket pocket and spread it carefully across a flat section of rock. Wind tried stealing it immediately. He pinned the edges down with loose stones and studied the faded contour lines again. That blue circle Howard had shown him yesterday sat directly over the eastern slope. Right here. Atlas suddenly turned his head sharply toward the crack itself. Mason looked up. The dog's nose twitched twice. Then Atlas stepped closer and pawed once at the edge of the opening. Not random. Intentional. Mason stared at the narrow gap for a long moment before standing up slowly. His knees popped from the cold. "Well," he muttered, "guess we're doing this." By 7:02 a.m., he had unloaded climbing gear from the Silverado's truck bed. Most of it was old but maintained well. Military habits again. Rope got cleaned. Carabiners checked. Equipment failures killed people faster than bullets sometimes. A faded REI sticker peeled from one side of the storage bin as he opened it. Atlas paced nearby while Mason secured a static rope around the trunk of a thick pine rooted deep into basalt. He tested the knot twice, then once more. Trust but verify, always. The crack itself was uglier in daylight. Narrow, sharp-edged, barely wider than Mason's shoulders in some places. Basalt walls disappeared downward at an angle steep enough to hide the bottom entirely. He clipped the flashlight to his jacket, then stopped. His breathing had shortened without him realizing. Tunnel, tight space, unknown depth, limited exits. For one bad second, his mind flashed backward again. Mud walls in Kandahar, collapsed irrigation tunnels, a flashlight beam cutting through airborne dust while somebody whispered, "Clear, left," over comms. Atlas pressed his nose firmly into Mason's hand, grounding him. Mason exhaled hard through his nose. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know." He crouched sideways and started descending. The first 8 feet were awkward more than dangerous. Loose rock shifted beneath his boots, while his shoulders scraped both walls. Cold stone dragged across canvas jacket sleeves with a grinding sound that echoed strangely downward. Then the crack narrowed harder. Mason had to turn sideways completely. Now one boot searching below while his left shoulder and him against rock. The rope stayed taut behind him. Claustrophobic. His pulse ticked higher automatically. He hated that too. The air changed around 15 feet down. Less wind, more moisture. The temperature climbed gradually until the freezing bite disappeared from his hands. Water somewhere below. At 23 feet, his flashlight beam finally reached a lower wall. At 35 feet, the crack widened suddenly enough for him to drop the last couple feet onto solid ground. Mason landed carefully and immediately swept the flashlight across the darkness. The beam caught black basalt walls first, then open space beyond them, big space. His breath fogged lightly in front of him while he slowly turned in a circle. The chamber stretched wider than he expected, maybe 40 feet across. The ceiling curved naturally overhead where ancient volcanic rock had hollowed out through centuries of underground water movement. Moisture shimmered faintly along the walls, and there was sound. Not wind anymore. Water. A constant low current somewhere deeper inside the chamber. Atlas whined from above. Mason looked up just in time to see 70 pounds of German Shepherd squeezing through the crack after him with absolutely no concern for personal safety. Damn it. Atlas dropped awkwardly the final few feet, slipped slightly on landing, then immediately regained balance and moved beside Mason like nothing had happened. Only then did Mason notice blood. A shallow cut along Atlas' front paw where sharp basalt had sliced him coming down. The dog ignored it completely, of course he did. Mason crouched briefly to inspect the wound while Atlas kept staring deeper into the chamber. Hold still. The cut wasn't terrible, just enough to leave small red tracks against dark stone. Mason cleaned it quickly using bottled water and wrapped it with gauze from an old field kit. Atlas tolerated exactly 7 seconds of treatment before pulling free and continuing forward. Business first. Mason followed. The flashlight beam moved slowly across the chamber, now revealing details one piece at a time. Old iron hooks hammered into stone, rotted support beams near one wall, a rusted lantern sitting upside down beside, collapsed shelving. Human work, not recent, but not ancient either. Mason stepped toward the center of the chamber carefully. His boots splashed suddenly into shallow water, flowing through a narrow natural channel carved directly into the basalt floor. Clear water, cold but not freezing. He crouched and dipped 2 fingers into the stream, moving steady. Atlas lowered his head and drank immediately. Mason pulled a small thermometer from his jacket pocket and held it near the airflow coming from deeper inside the chamber. 56 degrees, he checked again. Same reading. Outside, Montana sat below freezing, but down here the temperature barely moved. The realization settled slowly. This wasn't just a cave. It was insulated naturally. A survival space. His flashlight drifted farther right and caught something that made him stop moving completely. Fresh scrape marks, not fresh, but newer than everything else. Mason approached carefully. A rectangular metal box sat wedged between 2 basalt shelves partly hidden beneath debris. Water stains covered the lid. One corner showed corrosion, and attached near the latch, a brass lock, the exact size as the key in Mason's pocket. Atlas stood beside him now, completely still. Mason stared at the box without touching it for several seconds. Then he slowly removed the key. The brass felt warmer underground somehow. He slid it into the lock. It turned immediately, no resistance. The metal latch snapped open with a dull click that echoed softly through the chamber. Inside sat 3 objects wrapped carefully in oilcloth. A black notebook, a folded survey map, and a photograph. Mason picked up the photograph first. The image showed Walter Reed standing near the exact same underground stream nearly 15 years earlier. Younger, healthier, holding one hand against the rock wall, while smiling slightly at whoever took the picture. Mason stared at that smile longer than he meant to. His father rarely smiled in photographs. Atlas nudged Mason's elbow softly. Mason swallowed once and reached for the notebook. The leather cover had cracked with age, but the pages inside remained dry thanks to the oilcloth wrapping. His flashlight beam swept across the first page. Walter Reed, January 11, 2008. Thermal flow remains stable. Mason turned another page. Temperature logs, water depth measurements, airflow notes, years of records, careful, precise, obsessive. His father had been coming down here for a very long time. Mason flipped deeper into the notebook and froze again when he saw the words written near the bottom of one page. Subsurface access must remain private. Below it sat rough coordinate sketches matching sections of Dead Horse Ridge above ground. Then one final sentence underneath. Most men only see what the sun touches. Mason leaned back slowly against the basalt wall. Above them, wind faintly groaned through the ridge somewhere far overhead, but down here everything stayed steady, warm, protected. Atlas suddenly stiffened beside him. The dog turned toward darkness beyond the stream, not toward the entrance, deeper inside. Mason followed the dog's stare. His flashlight beam traveled past the water channel, farther into the chamber, until it caught another opening hidden behind a basalt shelf. A second tunnel, narrow, dark, descending even deeper underground, and from somewhere far beyond, it came the faint sound of moving water, much stronger this time. Mason stayed crouched beside the stream for several seconds without moving. Atlas stood rigid near the second tunnel entrance, head low, ears forward, body angled slightly sideways, the way working dogs positioned themselves when they sensed uncertainty but not immediate threat. The flashlight beam trembled faintly against the basalt wall. Not from fear, from fatigue, cold, tight muscles. That was what Mason told himself anyway. He slowly closed Walter Reed's notebook and slid it carefully inside his jacket. The leather felt dry and warm from the underground air, despite sitting hidden down here for years. Then, he looked toward the second tunnel again. The opening was narrower than the main chamber entrance, more deliberate somehow. The basalt around it looked smoother, darker from moisture. Water had been moving through there a very long time. Atlas glanced back at Mason once, waiting for direction. Mason checked his watch. 8:14 a.m. He should have climbed back out already. The weather forecast on AM radio last night mentioned incoming snow by afternoon. Visibility could disappear fast on the ridge if the storm shifted early. But the notebook changed things, because now this wasn't curiosity anymore. Now it was his father. He stepped carefully across the shallow stream, boots scraping wet stone. Atlas moved ahead immediately into the narrow tunnel without hesitation. Mason muttered under his breath. Of course you do. The second passage angled downward sharply enough that he had to brace one hand against the wall while moving. The air grew warmer with every few feet, not dramatically, just enough to notice through the cold trapped in his clothes from outside. Water echoed louder ahead. At one point, the tunnel narrowed so tightly, Mason had to remove his backpack and shove it ahead of him sideways through the gap. Basalt scraped his knuckles raw against the wall. Tunnel-clearing memory flashed again. Dark irrigation channels outside Panjwai. Knees soaked in mud, breathing recycled air while waiting for contact that might or might not come. Mason stopped moving immediately. Atlas noticed. The dog backed toward him and pressed briefly against Mason's leg. Solid weight, warm fur, grounding. Mason closed his eyes once, in through the nose, out through the mouth. The old combat breathing rhythm still worked if he caught himself early enough. After another moment, he picked the flashlight back up and kept moving. The tunnel finally widened 20 feet later, then opened all at once. Mason stepped into a second chamber nearly twice the size of the first. He stopped cold. The beam swept slowly across flowing water, dark stone, and rusted metal shapes half buried beneath mineral deposits. A larger underground reservoir filled most of the chamber floor, black as oil beneath the flashlight beam except where ripples caught the light. The sound of water moving through rock filled the entire space, steady, heavy, alive. Atlas moved carefully along the chamber edge while Mason stood there absorbing the scale of it. This wasn't natural accident alone anymore. Someone had worked down here. Old PVC pipe sections ran along one wall. A rusted turbine housing sat mounted near the reservoir edge, connected to what looked like homemade brackets bolted directly into basalt. Nearby, collapsed shelving held mold-stained containers and weatherproof supply bins layered thick with dust. Mason approached slowly. The turbine unit carried faded lettering. Micro Hydro Systems, Inc., Boise, Idaho. He crouched beside it. Homemade modifications everywhere. Electrical tape, reinforced couplings, careful weld seams. Walter Reed had built this. Not perfectly, but intelligently. Atlas sniffed near the back wall, then pawed lightly against a stack of storage crates, partly hidden beneath an old canvas tarp. Mason pulled the tarp aside. More supplies, freeze-dried food buckets, 2 dead marine batteries dated Aug 2013, a cracked Coleman lantern, several gallon water jugs long since evaporated dry, and folded carefully on top of one crate. A FEMA emergency shelter manual. Mason stared at it for a while without touching it. His father had been planning survival infrastructure down here, quietly, alone. Outside, everybody probably thought Walter Reed spent his later years drinking coffee and fixing fences badly enough to irritate Travis. Meanwhile, he'd been building an underground refuge beneath a forgotten ridge. Mason sat slowly on one of the storage crates. The chamber smelled faintly of wet mineral stone mixed with old machine oil and dust. Not unpleasant, just abandoned. Atlas climbed onto the flat rock beside him and finally lay down. For the first time since entering the ridge, the dog looked calm. That mattered. Working dogs noticed environments faster than people did. Atlas had spent years detecting explosives, hidden movement, unstable human behavior. If he relaxed somewhere, Mason paid attention. Mason opened the notebook again. Further back, Walter's entries became less technical. December 4, 2011. Wind severe above ridge. Interior stable. January 9, 2012. Stayed overnight successfully. Water flow unchanged. February 16, 2012. Travis would call this foolish. Maybe. He's right. Mason's jaw tightened slightly. He kept reading. March 2012. You can hear yourself think down here. Another entry farther in. April 18, 2013. No bank can take what they cannot find. Mason stared at that line longest. He remembered the foreclosure now, barely. Walter had nearly lost part of the ranch after 2 bad winters and a cattle disease outbreak. Travis managed to hold most of it together eventually. But those years changed the old man. After that, he trusted banks less. Trusted people less, too. Apparently, he trusted underground stone more than either. A sudden metallic clank echoed somewhere behind Mason. He spun instantly. Flashlight up. Breathing stopped. Atlas jumped to his feet with a low growl rolling through his chest. The beam swept across the chamber. Nothing moved. Just one loose pipe shifting slightly beneath flowing water pressure. Mason stayed frozen another 5 seconds anyway. Old reflex. His pulse hammered hard enough he could hear it. Then slowly the chamber settled again. Water, stone, silence. Atlas relaxed first. Mason lowered the flashlight after him. Yeah, he muttered quietly. Working on it. At 10:02 a.m., Mason finally climbed back toward the surface with the notebook secured beneath his jacket and one duffel bag full of salvageable supplies slung over his shoulder. The ascent felt harder, not physically, mentally, because now every inch of Dead Horse Ridge carried weight his father had hidden from the rest of them. Halfway up the crack, daylight appeared above in sharp white strips between stone. Wind whistled faintly downward through the opening. Atlas scrambled ahead first and disappeared topside. Mason followed seconds later and pulled himself out onto frozen basalt, breathing hard. The storm had moved in faster than expected. Gray snow clouds rolled low across the valley now, swallowing distant mountains almost completely. Wind drove loose ice crystals sideways across the ridge. Atlas stood near the opening, scanning the tree line again. Mason looked back at the narrow crack in the basalt, impossible to spot from 20 yards away. His father chose this place carefully. Back at camp, Mason fired up the propane stove and heated water while snow started falling lightly around the tarp shelter. Tiny white flecks hissed softly against the stove flame. He sat on the folding cot, with Walter's notebook open across his knee. Atlas slept nearby with one paw twitching occasionally in dreams. Mason kept reading, page after page of measurements, water temperatures, seasonal notes, air pressure changes. Then near the back, Walter's handwriting shifted rougher, less controlled. October 7, 2015. Mason would understand this place if he ever found it. Mason stopped there. Outside, wind hammered the tarp hard enough to shake the support line. He turned the page slowly. November 12, 2015. Travis sees land for what it earns. Mason sees land for what survives. Snow thickened around camp. Mason swallowed once and stared at the words until the ink blurred slightly beneath the lantern light. The old man had noticed more than Mason realized. A lot more. Atlas suddenly lifted his head, alert again. The dog stared uphill beyond camp toward the eastern side of the ridge. Mason listened carefully. At first he heard only wind, then something else, very faint, an engine. Not close, but climbing. Mason killed the propane stove instantly. The small blue flame vanished with a soft hiss and darkness swallowed half the tarp shelter before he grabbed the flashlight again. Snow tapped steadily against the canvas overhead. Now, wet snow, heavy. Atlas stood motionless near the shelter entrance, body angled toward the eastern slope, listening. The engine sound drifted through the storm another few seconds before cutting out completely. Silence followed, too much silence. Mason checked his watch. 4:31 p.m. Nobody should have been climbing this ridge in weather like this, unless they already knew where they were going. His eyes moved automatically across the camp perimeter. Truck position, tree cover, escape angle, sight lines, old habits again. Atlas gave a low growl. Mason crouched beside him and rested one hand lightly against the dog's neck. He could feel the vibration deep in Atlas's chest. Easy. The growl stopped, but the dog stayed tense. Mason killed the lantern too, and waited another full minute inside darkness broken only by snowlight filtering through the tarp seams. Wind rolled hard across the ridge, carrying loose ice crystals that hissed through the trees. Then came the sound again, a truck door slamming somewhere downhill. Mason moved immediately, not fast, quiet. He stepped outside the tarp shelter and crossed behind a basalt outcrop, overlooking the washed-out fire road below. Snow soaked into his jeans at the knees while he crouched low against the rock. Atlas stayed beside him without command. Two figures stood near the lower bend in the trail, beside a dark pickup truck partly hidden through the snowfall. Mason couldn't make out faces at this distance, but he could see flashlights moving slowly across the ridge. Searching. One beam swept briefly toward Mason's camp before moving on. Then one of the men pointed uphill, toward the eastern slope, toward the crack. Mason's jaw tightened. Atlas stared too. The men never climbed farther. After a few minutes, they returned to the truck. Headlights flicked on, and the vehicle slowly backed down the trail again before disappearing through the trees. Mason stayed crouched another 30 seconds anyway. Trusting silence got people killed. Finally, he stood. Atlas shook snow from his coat. "You know them?" The dog didn't answer, obviously, but Mason already knew what mattered most. Somebody else knew this ridge wasn't worthless. Back inside the tarp shelter, he reopened Walter's notebook while snow thickened outside. Wind shoved hard against the canvas every few minutes like giant invisible hands testing weak points. One notebook entry caught his eye now. November 3, 2014. Tracks near eastern slope again. Another entry beneath it. Never use the same approach path twice. Mason looked toward the darkness outside the tarp. His father had hidden this place from somebody. Not just everybody. Somebody specific. By 6:12 p.m., snow covered half the Silverado's tires downhill. Mason ate cold jerky beside the lantern while Atlas finally slept near the entrance again, though one ear still twitched constantly at outside sounds. Mason kept reading deeper into the notebook, then stopped suddenly at one folded page tucked between entries. A receipt, Missoula Builder Supply. Dated June 14, 2013, PVC pipe fittings, 218.47s. Walter had spent real money building the underground system, more than Mason ever would have guessed. Another folded page held a hand-drawn diagram of the second chamber reservoir, with arrows marking water flow direction and estimated pressure output. At the bottom, Walter had written, "Enough water to keep people alive if the valley ever dries." Mason stared at that line a long time. The old man had never been crazy, obsessive maybe. Stubborn, definitely, but not crazy. Outside, wind suddenly slammed the tarp hard enough to rip one support stake loose. Canvas snapped violently overhead. Atlas jumped upright instantly. Mason moved fast, already outside, before fully thinking. Snow whipped sideways across the ridge, so thick now, visibility barely reached 30 feet. He grabbed the loose line and fought the wind, while driving the stake deeper into frozen ground using the back of a hatchet. Ice stung his face hard enough to numb his cheeks. Another gust hit. The basalt beneath his boots shifted slightly. Mason froze. Not the ridge itself, Loose surface rock. He looked toward the eastern crack. Snow had started drifting heavily across that entire section of slope. If enough weight accumulated above unstable basalt, the realization hit him immediately. The entrance could collapse. Mason stood there, breathing hard in the storm, while snow gathered across his shoulders. Then he looked downhill toward the Silverado, then back toward the hidden chamber beneath the ridge. Decision made itself. By 7:04 p.m., he had packed essential gear into 2 duffels and clipped climbing rope around his waist. Atlas paced anxiously near the crack, while Mason secured another anchor point against the pine tree. Wind screamed across the ridge now. The storm had fully arrived. "Down," Mason ordered. Atlas obeyed instantly and slipped through the narrow opening first. Mason followed with 1 duffel slung behind him. The descent felt worse in darkness and blowing snow. Basalt scraped against his shoulders while rope fibers burned lightly through his gloves. Below, warm air still rose steadily upward through the crack. Good. He reached the lower chamber breathing harder this time. Atlas already waited beside the underground stream while snow filtered faintly down from above through tiny openings in the rock. Mason set up quickly. Lantern, supplies, sleeping roll. The underground chamber transformed immediately beneath warm yellow light. Shadows stretched huge against basalt walls while flowing water reflected flickering gold across the ceiling. Safer than outside, for now. At 9:18 p.m., the storm intensified above them. Mason could hear it through the ridge itself now. Deep vibrations traveling through stone as wind hammered Dead Horse Ridge from every direction. Atlas remained restless. The dog kept glancing toward the upper entrance every few minutes. Then around 10:41 p.m., the sound came. A deep cracking noise, muted through stone. Mason stood instantly. Another crack followed, louder, rock shifting. Atlas barked sharply. Then the mountain moved. The impact thundered through the chamber with a violent roar that shook dust loose from the ceiling. Mason grabbed the lantern before it toppled while basalt groaned somewhere above them. The upper tunnel. Something collapsed. Dust exploded downward through the crack entrance in thick gray clouds. Atlas barked again. Louder this time. Mason grabbed the flashlight and sprinted toward the tunnel, despite the loose rock still falling around them. Halfway up the narrow passage, he saw it. The upper section had partially caved inward. Basalt slabs now blocked nearly half the opening. Snow poured through the remaining gap in white streams. Mason climbed higher carefully, wedging boots against rock while testing every handhold first. The ceiling groaned again. Bad sound. Very bad. Atlas barked from below urgently now. Mason ignored it and shoved against one loose slab, blocking the remaining passage. It shifted suddenly, too suddenly. The basalt beneath Mason's left foot gave way completely. The world dropped. He fell hard through darkness and slammed shoulder first into jagged stone 12 feet below. White pain exploded down his arm instantly. The flashlight flew somewhere into darkness. For several seconds, Mason couldn't breathe at all. Dust filled the chamber. Stone fragments rained down around him. Then sound came back all at once. Atlas barking, rock falling, water roaring nearby. Mason rolled onto one elbow with a sharp gasp that turned into a curse halfway through. His left shoulder burned deep and wrong beneath the jacket. Dislocated maybe, or worse. Atlas reached him seconds later, whining sharply while nosing against Mason's face and chest. "I'm good," Mason lied immediately. The dog didn't believe him. Mason tried pushing himself upright and nearly blacked out from the pain that shot through his shoulder blade. His vision narrowed briefly at the edges. Not broken, probably. Still usable, maybe. He flexed his fingers slowly. Movement remained. Good sign. Above them, the tunnel entrance had collapsed almost completely now. Snow drifted downward through narrow gaps in the basalt pile, while wind screamed faintly beyond it. Atlas suddenly yelped. Mason looked down. A long slice ran across the dog's side, where falling basalt had clipped him during the collapse. Blood darkened the fur beneath the lantern light. Damn it! Atlas ignored the wound entirely and pressed closer against Mason instead. Still protecting him, Mason forced himself upright 1 inch at a time, using the wall for leverage. His left arm barely functioned now. Every movement sent deep grinding pain through the joint. He looked toward the blocked entrance, then toward the second chamber reservoir deeper underground. No easy way out anymore. The mountain had just changed the rules, and somewhere above the storm kept burying Dead Horse Ridge deeper beneath snow. Mason stood motionless beside the collapsed tunnel, while dust still drifted through the lantern light like smoke after a firefight. His left arm hung useless against his side now, not completely dead, but close enough. Atlas circled once around him, limping slightly from the cut along his ribs. The dog kept looking upward, still expecting danger. Mason finally forced himself to move. First priority always stayed the same. Stop the bleeding, secure shelter, inventory supplies. Training never really left. He guided Atlas toward the main chamber and dropped carefully onto one knee beside the stream. Pain ripped through his shoulder hard enough to blur his vision for half a second. The lantern shook in his grip. Atlas stayed still while Mason examined the wound. About 5 inches long, not too deep, lucky. Mason opened the old trauma pouch from his backpack using mostly one hand. The zipper snagged twice because his fingers wouldn't stop trembling from adrenaline and pain. Hold still. Atlas obeyed immediately. The antiseptic wipe made the dog flinch once, but he never pulled away. Mason cleaned the cut carefully, then wrapped the rib section with gauze and elastic bandage from the kit. Military surplus. Expiration date almost worn off. Still worked. When Mason finally leaned back against the basalt wall, sweat chilled instantly beneath his thermal shirt, despite the chamber warmth. Atlas limped over and settled beside him without invitation. The stream moved steadily nearby. The mountain breathed around them. At 12:26 a.m., Mason finally examined his own shoulder properly. Bad news. The joint looked swollen already beneath the flannel, and movement past chest height sent sharp, grinding pain through the collarbone area. Maybe partial tear, maybe separation. Either way, he wasn't climbing out tonight. Probably not tomorrow either. Mason swallowed 2 ibuprofen dry and stared toward the block tunnel while wind groaned faintly through stone overhead. Then came the counting. 1 entrance compromised, 1 secondary chamber. Estimated food supply, maybe 19 days if rationed carefully. Propane limited, medical supplies minimal. His mind kept organizing survival math automatically. Same thing it used to do during long-range patrols in Kandahar when things went sideways. Outside temperatures would likely hit below 15 degrees by morning. Inside the chamber remained stable, 56 Fahrenheit. Walter had been right. The ridge could keep people alive. Around 2:07 a.m., Mason drifted into shallow sleep against the wall beside Atlas. Then the helicopter came back. Not real, memory. Rotor blades hammered overhead while orange dust swirled through Afghan heat. Somebody screamed for a medic somewhere behind him. Radio chatter cracked through gunfire. Mason woke violently with his hand already reaching for the pistol that wasn't there anymore. His breathing turned ragged instantly. Atlas shoved against him hard. Solid weight, warm fur, present moment. Mason blinked fast in darkness lit only by dying lantern glow. Underground chamber. Montana, not Afghanistan. The old ranger breathing rhythm came back slowly. 4 seconds in, hold. 4 seconds out. Atlas stayed pressed against him until the shaking in Mason's hands finally eased. By morning, the storm above still hadn't stopped. At 7:43 a.m., snow filtered steadily through tiny cracks near the collapsed tunnel entrance. Mason climbed halfway up the debris pile to inspect it closer. Bad. Several basalt slabs the size of refrigerators had shifted into the upper shaft. Digging through by hand would take days with two good arms. He only had one. Mason slid carefully back down and winced hard when his shoulder clipped the rock wall. Atlas watched him constantly now. The dog noticed weakness fast. Mason heated instant coffee beside the stream while reading more of Walter's notebook. The old man had documented winter temperatures for nearly 17 years with obsessive precision. January 2016, outside temp 11 Fahrenheit. Interior stable at 55 degrees. February 2017, surface blizzard conditions. Water flow unchanged. Walter trusted numbers more than people. Mason understood that better now. At 9:18 a.m., Atlas suddenly stood and stared toward the secondary chamber tunnel. Not barking, listening. Mason reached for the flashlight immediately. The dog moved ahead slowly this time, nose low near the stone floor. Mason followed one-handed, keeping the lantern beam steady while pain pulsed through his shoulder with every step. The second chamber looked unchanged. Then Mason noticed it. Fresh water movement near the reservoir edge. Stronger current. The underground spring had intensified after the collapse. Water now rushed harder through the lower basalt opening near the turbine housing, producing a low mechanical hum as it pushed against old pipe fittings. Mason crouched carefully beside it. The flow looked almost pressurized now. Interesting. He shined the flashlight deeper into the lower tunnel feeding the reservoir. The passage extended farther than he realized before curving out of sight. Walter never finished mapping this section. Mason found no entries about it anywhere in the notebook. Atlas growled softly. Not fear, alertness. Mason looked again at the dark tunnel disappearing beneath the ridge. Another route, maybe, or another collapse waiting to happen. He backed away slowly, one problem at a time. By the third day underground, routine started replacing panic. That mattered. Humans survived longer when rhythm returned. Mason organized the chamber carefully despite the shoulder injury. Food crates stacked near the dry wall section. Water purification tablets beside the stream. Lantern fuel counted twice. Remaining inventory: 3 cans Bush's beans, half-bag rice, 4 protein bars, jerky, coffee grounds, 1 propane cylinder half full. Not great, but not desperate yet. Atlas began disappearing periodically for short stretches through narrow cracks near the secondary reservoir. At first, Mason tried stopping him. Then the dog returned carrying a snowshoe hare. Everything changed after that. Mason cleaned the rabbit beside the stream while Atlas watched proudly despite the bandage around his ribs. The dog's military training never fully erased instinct. Predator still lived underneath obedience. That night, Mason cooked rabbit meat slowly over the propane burner while snowstorms hammered the ridge above. Grease crackled softly inside the pan. The smell filled the chamber. Real food, first hot protein in days. Mason gave Atlas the larger portion without hesitation. The dog ate quickly, then settled near the chamber entrance again, standing watch while Mason reopened Walter's notebook. Another folded paper slipped loose this time. A denial letter. U.S. Geological Survey. Dated August 18, 2009. Request declined due to insufficient preliminary data. Walter had tried telling people. Nobody listened. Mason leaned back against the basalt wall, holding the paper while lantern shadows moved across the ceiling. He remembered standing in Walter's garage once years ago before deployment. The old man had spread maps across a workbench, trying to explain underground water tables, while Mason packed military gear into duffel bags. Mason barely listened then. Thought it was old man obsession, they argued, hard. Last thing Walter said before Mason left for Afghanistan. Someday you'll learn the difference between land that's useful and land that just looks expensive. Mason hadn't answered. Now here he sat inside the mountain his father spent years protecting. A low sound interrupted the memory. Atlas. The dog stood again facing upward toward the blocked tunnel. Mason listened. Faint. Very faint. Voices. Somewhere above the collapsed entrance, human voices, Then metal striking stone. Somebody was on Dead Horse Ridge again. Mason blew out the lantern instantly. Darkness swallowed the chamber. Only the underground stream remained, moving softly through basalt somewhere beside them, while snowmelt dripped from the blocked shaft overhead. Atlas stood frozen near the tunnel entrance, ears lifted high. Another metallic hit echoed faintly through the rock. Clang, pause. Clang, not random. Tools. Mason reached for the flashlight, but didn't switch it on. His breathing slowed automatically into the quiet rhythm he used before patrols outside Kandahar when they waited movement near an eld nobody trusted. Count sounds. Track distance. Listen first. The strikes came from directly above the collapse zone. Somebody digging. Atlas shifted his weight slightly and looked back toward Mason, waiting again. At 8:52 a.m., a muffled voice filtered faintly down through the basalt, too distorted to understand. Then another voice answered. 2 people minimum. Mason stayed completely still for nearly 30 seconds before moving closer toward the debris pile. Pain stabbed deep through his shoulder immediately, but he ignored it and climbed halfway up the broken slope carefully. Loose stone shifted beneath his boots. Bad footing. He crouched beside a narrow opening where snow drifted through from above and listened harder. One voice sounded younger, the other older, rough smoker's voice. Then he heard the words clearly. Told you somebody's been down here. Mason's jaw tightened. Not rescue workers, not county crews either. Atlas growled low enough Mason barely heard it himself. Quiet, he whispered. The dog obeyed instantly. More scraping followed overhead, then silence. A minute later, an engine started somewhere above the ridge again and slowly faded downhill through the storm. Gone. Mason stayed frozen another full minute anyway. Combat taught him. The second man often waited after the first one moved. Finally, he slid carefully back down into the chamber. Atlas followed close beside him. Mason relit the lantern this time with slower hands. His shoulder had stiffened badly overnight. The swelling spread down into his upper arm now, turning movement clumsy. He needed medical help soon, but first he needed to understand who else knew about the ridge. The answer came faster than expected. At the back of Walter's notebook, Mason found another folded section stuck between water pressure calculations and reservoir diagrams. A property survey map. Different from the first one. Several sections had been marked in red ink near the eastern ridge slope. Small handwritten notes filled the margins. Vehicle tracks. Observed twice near lower access road. Black pickup with no ranch tags. Another note farther down. Cole asking too many questions. Mason stared at the handwriting. So Walter knew, or suspected. Atlas suddenly limped toward the secondary chamber again and disappeared briefly into darkness beyond the reservoir tunnel. Mason almost called him back, then stopped. The dog returned, dragging something behind him through shallow water. Old canvas. Mason frowned and pulled it closer one-handed. Not canvas. A sleeping bag, military surplus. Mold-stained but intact. Mason checked the faded label. U.S. Army issue. His father had actually lived down here. Not visited. Lived. The realization settled slowly across the chamber while water echoed around him. Walter Reed had hidden underground beneath Dead Horse Ridge after losing the ranch loan years ago, probably alone, probably during winter. Mason looked around again with different eyes now. The stacked food crates, the homemade turbine, the careful ventilation cuts near the ceiling. Not paranoia, preparation. The old man built himself a fallback position. Like soldiers did. Atlas returned again, carrying something smaller this time. A metal coffee tin. Mason opened it carefully. Inside sat waterproof matches, 3 silver dollars dated 1964, and several folded photographs sealed inside plastic freezer bags. The first photo showed Walter standing near the underground reservoir, years younger than Mason remembered him. Beard longer, face thinner. Alive in a different way. The second photo stopped Mason cold. Walter stood beside another man near the tunnel entrance holding surveying equipment. Both men wore heavy winter jackets dusted with snow. Mason recognized him immediately. Howard Kemp, the lawyer. Much younger then, but unmistakable. So Howard knew about the chamber too, at least partly. Mason flipped the photograph over. January 2012. Water held steady through winter. No signature. Just that. Atlas rested beside the stream while Mason studied the rest of the photos. Most showed measurements, equipment, or sections of ridge terrain. Then one photo didn't fit. A close-up of tire tracks, black pickup, aggressive off-road tread, taken near the lower access road. On the back, Walter had written only 3 words, not county vehicles. Mason leaned back slowly against the wall. The old man had spent years documenting people watching the ridge, not just the water beneath it. Around 11:16 a.m., hunger finally forced Mason to move again. He heated rice and rabbit meat together in an old dented pan while snow continued filtering softly through cracks above. Atlas watched every movement carefully. The dog's wound looked better already, still sore, but clean. Military working dogs healed tough, probably tougher than handlers sometimes. After eating, Mason explored farther into the lower reservoir tunnel, despite the shoulder pain. Atlas stayed close enough that his fur occasionally brushed Mason's leg in the darkness. The tunnel narrowed quickly near the waterline, then widened again. Mason swept the flashlight beam across rough basalt walls, slick with mineral moisture. Rusted pipe sections disappeared deeper into darkness beside the flowing spring. Walter had tried routing water somewhere farther underground. Why? Another 20 feet in, Mason found the answer. An old steel hatch bolted directly into the basalt floor beside the spring channel. Industrial grade, heavy. A faded yellow sticker still clung partly to the surface. Missoula County, Emergency Management. Mason crouched beside it slowly. The bolts looked ancient. Rust spread thick around the edges. But somebody had installed this deliberately decades ago. Atlas sniffed near the hatch, then backed away slightly. Mason wiped grime from the metal using his sleeve. Another label appeared beneath the dirt. Property of Montana Civil Defense, 1968. Mason stared at it. Cold War era. Underground emergency infrastructure. That explained part of it. Maybe Walter discovered the chamber accidentally after old county survey work decades ago. Maybe the government abandoned it before completion. Then Walter took over, built on top of it, protected it. Mason tested the hatch carefully with one hand, locked or jammed shut after years underground. Either way, it wasn't opening today with one functioning arm. He backed away slowly. The deeper he explored this ridge, the less accidental any of it felt. By late afternoon, the storm finally weakened above them. Less vibration moved through the stone overhead now. Snowmelt dripped steadily through cracks near the collapsed shaft. Mason climbed carefully back toward the debris pile again, carrying the flashlight and a pry bar from Walter's supply crates. Atlas followed, limping slightly. Near the upper collapse section, Mason finally spotted daylight again through a narrow gap between 2 basalt slabs. Small opening, but real. Cold air flowed through it steadily. Good sign. He tested one loose rock carefully with the pry bar. Too unstable. The entire pile could shift. Mason exhaled slowly through clenched teeth. No brute force. Not with one arm. Not here. He climbed back down again and sat heavily near the stream while Atlas rested beside him. For a long time, neither moved. The chamber stayed warm. The water kept moving. The mountain held. Then Mason reopened Walter's notebook once more, beneath the lantern glow. Near the final pages, he found something folded carefully into the spine. A cashier's check copy. Veterans Food Pantry, Missoula County. $2,500 donation. Another check. Western Montana Veterans Housing Fund. $4,000. Another. Anonymous. 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 Mason stared at the signatures. Walter Reed. The old man who supposedly lost everything had quietly spent years helping other veterans survive. Without telling anyone, without needing credit, Atlas rested his chin against Mason's boot. The lantern crackled softly beside the stream, and somewhere deep beneath Dead Horse Ridge, Mason finally understood something that hurt worse than the shoulder. His father hadn't hidden down here because he was broken. He'd hidden down here because nobody listened until things collapsed. Above them, faintly through snow and stone, another engine echoed across the ridge, this time closer, much closer. Atlas rose before the engine fully stopped. The German shepherd's posture changed instantly. Head low, tail rigid, ears sharp toward the collapsed shaft above them. Mason killed the lantern again. Darkness folded over the chamber. A few seconds later came the muffled crunch of boots on snow directly overhead. 2 people, maybe 3. Hard to tell through basalt. Mason moved quietly toward the debris slope despite the burning ache in his shoulder. Atlas stayed glued to his side now, every step measured and silent. The mountain carried sound strangely. One voice echoed clearer than before. "Truck's still down there," another answered. "So somebody made it out." Mason stopped moving. That meant they'd seen the Silverado, which meant they'd been watching longer than he realized. Snow filtered steadily through the collapsed gap above. Tiny white flecks drifted through darkness, while another metallic scrape echoed overhead. Shovels, not rescue. Digging. Mason crouched beside the narrow air gap and listened carefully. The older voice spoke again. "Cole said the old man found something down here years ago." Cole, there it was. Atlas growled low in his throat. Mason rested one hand lightly against the dog's neck until the growl stopped. Above them, one of the men laughed quietly. Guy probably froze already. Boots crunched closer overhead. Then a sudden cracking sound echoed through the collapse pile. Stone shifting. One of the men cursed immediately. "Back off! Back off!" Their footsteps retreated fast after that. A truck engine started seconds later and slowly disappeared downslope through the storm. Silence returned. Mason stayed still a long time afterward. Then he finally whispered, "Cole Branner." The name tasted bitter now. Atlas nudged Mason's good hand once before limping back toward the lantern area. At 7:18 a.m. the next morning, Mason climbed carefully through the secondary reservoir tunnel, carrying Walter's flashlight, notebook, and the old pry bar. The storm had weakened overnight, but cold air still pushed through cracks in the ridge above. His shoulder barely lifted past chest height now. Bad sign. Every movement produced a dull, grinding sensation beneath the collarbone. Mason ignored it. He had more immediate problems. The deeper tunnel curved sharply, left after 40 feet, before opening into another narrow basalt corridor, lined with old utility pipe. The walls carried strange mineral streaks that glimmered silver beneath the flashlight beam. Atlas moved ahead carefully, sniffing constantly. The dog suddenly stopped beside a rusted electrical junction box bolted to the wall. Mason crouched beside it. Inside sat several old documents sealed inside a weatherproof military bag. Not government paperwork, property records, land surveys, water flow estimates, underground mapping diagrams, and one business card. Black Pine Development, L.C. Bozeman, Montana. The card looked newer than everything else. Mason stared at it for several seconds. Someone had been down here recently, very recently. He opened another folded document carefully. A typed purchase proposal. Walter Reed had been offered $41,000 for Dead Horse Ridge in 2016. Unsigned. Walter never sold. Atlas suddenly barked once. Sharp, warning bark. Mason shut off the flashlight immediately. Darkness swallowed them again. A faint beam flickered somewhere ahead, deeper inside the tunnel. Not theirs. Someone else's light. Mason lowered himself silently against the wall, while Atlas pressed beside him without making another sound. The distant beam moved slowly for maybe 3 seconds, then disappeared. Mason listened hard. Nothing. No footsteps. No voices. Only water moving underground. His pulse hammered anyway, Because somebody else had access routes into this ridge. Routes Walter never mentioned. Mason waited another full minute before turning the flashlight back on. The tunnel ahead sat empty, but fresh boot prints covered the damp basalt floor. Recent. The tread looked expensive too. Deep winter hiking soles, not ranch boots. Mason photographed the tracks using his old cracked Samsung phone, even though the device barely held charge anymore. One print overlapped, another older print already dried into mineral residue. This had been happening repeatedly. Atlas sniffed the tracks again and growled softly. Mason followed the trail deeper. At 9:42 a.m., the tunnel widened into a partially finished underground room, reinforced with old concrete supports and rusted steel braces. Cold War construction again. An abandoned civil defense shelter, most of it unfinished. Old bunk frames leaned against walls beside collapsed storage shelves. A faded emergency sign still hung crooked near one doorway, max occupancy. 18 persons. Mason swept the flashlight across the room slowly. Dust everywhere, but not untouched dust. Fresh footprints crossed the floor. Near the far wall sat stacked plastic water drums and a portable drilling core sample kit worth several $1,000s. Modern equipment, not Walter's. Mason approached slowly. The drill case carried a shipping label, BPD Environmental Survey Division. Black Pine Development, Cole's people. Atlas suddenly stiffened again. Then Mason heard it too. An engine rumbling faintly above ground directly overhead. Closer now, very close. Somebody parked on the ridge itself. Mason moved fast despite the shoulder pain. He killed the flashlight again and guided Atlas behind one of the old concrete partitions. Voices drifted faintly through ventilation shafts overhead. Then one became unmistakable. "Cole Branner, you sure the collapse didn't seal it completely?" Another man answered. "Thermal readings still show airflow." Mason's jaw locked hard. Thermal readings. They'd been scanning the ridge. Cole continued talking overhead while boots shifted across snow. "Listen, Black Pine doesn't care about the cave itself. They care about the aquifer under it. Resort investors are already asking questions." Another pause. Then, "If Reed's still alive down there, he'll come out eventually." Atlas pressed tighter against Mason's leg. The dog could feel tension through body movement alone now. Mason listened without breathing. Cole's voice lowered slightly. The old man figured out this ridge connects to a larger underground water table. That kind of access becomes real money when drought hits. Mason closed his eyes briefly. Walter knew. All those years, everybody called him paranoid, while companies quietly circled the ridge waiting for proof. Boots crunched overhead again, then faded. The engine eventually pulled away down the ridge road, gone again. Mason stayed hidden another minute before finally standing. His shoulder throbbed viciously now from holding tension too long. Atlas looked up at him. Mason exhaled slowly. "They're not looking for rocks." The dog blinked once. At 11:03 a.m., Mason returned to the main chamber carrying the drill company paperwork and the old survey documents. He spread everything across Walter's work crate beside the stream. The puzzle pieces finally lined up. Walter discovered the aquifer years ago. Black Pine Development learned rumors somehow. Cole saw opportunity. And now Mason sat trapped inside the mountain everybody wanted. Atlas suddenly limped toward the collapsed shaft again, then barked twice. Different bark this time, not warning. "Attention!" Mason climbed carefully toward the debris pile and spotted something half-buried near the upper snow drift. A bright orange climbing rope, fresh. One end disappeared upward through the collapse. The other had been lowered intentionally into the shaft sometime after the cave-in. Mason grabbed it cautiously. Tied to the end was a small waterproof bag. Inside sat three things: a protein bar, a flashlight battery pack, and a folded handwritten note. Mason opened it slowly beneath the lantern glow. The handwriting wasn't Cole's. It read, "I know you're alive down there. Don't trust Black Pine. If you can climb by morning, come alone to mile marker 17 off Highway 93. H.K. Howard Kemp, the old lawyer. Atlas stared up toward the shaft while snow drifted softly through the broken basalt overhead. And somewhere far above them, another storm front was already moving across Montana. Mason read Howard Kemp's note 3 more times beside the lantern. Short message. No extra explanation. Very Howard. The old lawyer had probably spent 40 years learning how to say only what mattered. Atlas finally walked over and rested beside the stream again, though he kept glancing upward every few seconds. The dog didn't trust the mountain anymore. Neither did Mason. At 6:48 a.m., Mason tied the orange rope around a basalt support beam and tested tension carefully using one arm. His shoulder protested immediately with a sharp stab beneath the collarbone. Still functional, barely. He clipped Walter's notebook inside a weather-proof pack, along with the property maps, Uzji's denial letter, and the photographs from the second chamber. If Black Pine wanted the ridge badly enough to send survey teams during a blizzard, then those papers mattered. A lot. Atlas stood ready beside the debris slope. "You're staying close this time." The dog blinked once. That usually meant yes. The climb through the collapse took nearly 40 minutes, too slow. Mason hated moving slow. Every loose slab had to be tested first before shifting weight. Snowmelt dripped steadily through cracks above, while wind moaned somewhere higher on the ridge. Twice the debris shifted beneath him. Twice Atlas froze instantly, waiting for Mason's next movement before continuing. Military dogs learned caution from handlers. Handlers learned survival from dogs, too. By the time Mason finally reached the surface, gray daylight had already swallowed Dead Horse Ridge beneath another layer of snow. The Silverado sat half-buried near the tarp shelter. Windshield frosted solid, the ridge looked untouched, like the mountain had erased every sign of struggle overnight. Mason stood breathing cold air into aching lungs while Atlas immediately began scanning the tree line. Perimeter first. Always. The old ranger reflex stayed alive even after all these years. At 8:11 a.m., Mason got the truck running after 2 failed attempts and a burst of black exhaust that rolled across the frozen ridge. The heater coughed weakly at first, before finally pushing out stale warmth that smelled faintly like old coffee and engine oil. The gas gauge sat below quarter tank. Good enough. Highway 93 looked nearly abandoned beneath fresh snow. A county plow had passed earlier, leaving dirty ridges of ice along the shoulders. Mason drove one-handed through the Bitterroot Valley, while Atlas rested silently in the passenger seat, occasionally lifting his head whenever headlights approached. Mile marker 17 sat near an old fishing access road south of Lolo. Howard Kemp's Ford Ranger waited there already, dark blue. Rust near the rear wheel well. Driver door dented. Mason parked 30 yards away first instead of pulling directly beside him. Habit. Atlas watched the older lawyer through the windshield without blinking. Howard stepped carefully from the truck, wearing a canvas barn coat and heavy gloves. Snow clung to his shoulders while cold wind pushed gray hair loose around his ears. He looked tired, more tired than Mason remembered. "Thought maybe you wouldn't come," Howard said quietly. Mason stayed beside the Silverado door instead of walking closer. "You knew about the chambers." Howard nodded once. "Knew enough." Atlas climbed out slowly and positioned himself beside Mason's leg. Not aggressive, just visible. Howard noticed the bandage on the dog immediately. Then the sling improvised around Mason's shoulder. What happened up there? Mountain shifted. Howard exhaled slowly through his nose like somebody who already expected worse news. Snow drifted sideways across the highway between them. Passing traffic sounded distant out here. Mason finally stepped closer. "You need to start talking." Howard glanced toward the mountains before answering. "Your father found the first spring opening back in 2008 after a small landslide. He brought me up there because he needed legal advice about mineral and water access rights. Mason stayed silent. Howard continued. He thought the aquifer beneath the ridge could become critical someday. Drought projections, population growth. He tried contacting the county first. Nobody listened. That notebook says he filed with USGS. He did. What happened? Howard gave a tired half-shrug. Walter Reed wasn't exactly polished. He sounded angry during meetings. Obsessive sometimes. County officials dismissed him as another rancher yelling about land rights. Mason looked away toward the snow-covered valley. Sounded familiar. Howard reached inside his coat and pulled out another folder sealed in plastic. Your father kept records of everything. Water temperatures, flow stability, land surveys, people asking questions they shouldn't. Mason took the folder carefully. Inside sat copies of cashier's checks, veterans' housing funds, medical debt assistance, food pantry donations, thousands of dollars, all anonymous. Mason stared at the totals silently. $2,750, $1,860, year after year. Howard watched him quietly before speaking again. Walter used profits from selling timber rights years ago. Most people assumed he lost all that money after the ranch loans collapsed. He didn't. No. Howard shook his head. He hid most of it. Said veterans understood survival better than politicians ever would. Wind rattled the highway sign beside them. Atlas shifted closer against Mason's leg. Howard's face tightened slightly before he continued. Your father believed something else, too. Mason waited. He believed only one of his sons would stay long enough to understand the ridge. Silence settled there for several seconds. Cars hissed faintly along distant wet pavement. Finally, Mason asked, "Why me?" Howard gave a small, sad smile. Because Travis always measured land by cattle numbers. You measured it by whether you could survive on it. That hit harder than Mason expected. Not because it sounded dramatic, because it sounded true. Howard reached into the truck again and removed another item carefully wrapped inside old flannel cloth. Walter's revolver. Smith & Wesson Model 10, bluing worn nearly silver at the grip edges. Mason recognized it immediately from childhood. Your father wanted you to have this if anybody ever came after the aquifer rights. Mason took the revolver slowly. Heavy, cold, familiar. The cylinder remained unloaded. Howard handed him a separate ammo box. Walter thought Black Pine Development would eventually figure things out. They started sniffing around 3 years ago after some private hydrology studies near Bozeman. Coal's involved deep. Yes. Howard looked genuinely disappointed saying it. Coal brokered land meetings for them. At first he thought the ridge only had geothermal tourism potential. Then they discovered the larger water system. Mason leaned against the Silverado carefully, protecting his shoulder from sudden movement. Why didn't you warn me sooner? Howard stared out toward the highway. Because Walter made me promise something. He paused. He said if you walked away from the ridge, then maybe you deserved peace more than responsibility. Snowflakes drifted quietly between them. But if I stayed, Howard finally looked back at him. Then you'd already understand. At 10:22 a.m., Howard convinced Mason to let him drive them toward Missoula for medical treatment. Providence St. Patrick Hospital smelled exactly like every hospital Mason ever hated. Antiseptic, burnt coffee, old tile floors. Atlas stayed beside him through registration until a nurse finally asked if the dog was service-trained. He's retired military, Mason answered. The nurse nodded like that, explained everything. Maybe it did. Room 214 radiology took 37 minutes. The X-ray technician, a younger guy named Darren, with tattoo sleeves disappearing beneath hospital scrubs, glanced twice at the old Ranger tattoo near Mason's shoulder before saying quietly, "My uncle was 75th Ranger Regiment, too." Mason only nodded once. The diagnosis came at 12:04 p.m. Separated AC joint, partial ligament tear, no fracture. Lucky. The physician assistant, Claire Holloway, adjusted Mason's sling while reading the chart tablet carefully. Mid-50s, maybe. Sharp eyes behind rectangular glasses. Calm voice. You planning to actually rest this shoulder? Mason almost laughed. Almost. Claire noticed the old bruises along his ribs, too, and the sleep deprivation around his eyes. Veteran? Yeah, Afghanistan? Mason looked at her once. She nodded slightly. My husband was Marine Recon. She tightened the sling carefully. You all carry yourselves the same after enough deployments. Atlas rested beneath the exam table the entire conversation, still watching. Claire prescribed anti-inflammatory medication and handed Mason the billing estimate afterward. $6,903 after insurance denial. Mason stared at the number without speaking. Claire noticed. So did Walter, she said quietly. Mason looked up sharply. You knew my father? A little. Claire removed her glasses briefly. He came through here several winters ago, dehydrated and exhausted after spending too much time alone up in those mountains. She paused. He talked about underground water systems constantly. Everybody thought he was rambling. But you didn't. Claire gave the smallest shrug. I'm a geology adjunct at University of Montana on weekends. She smiled faintly. Your father knew exactly what he was talking about. That changed the room instantly. Mason sat forward despite the shoulder pain. Claire lowered her voice slightly. If the ridge really contains the kind of stable aquifer system Walter described, Blackapine won't stop pushing for access. Atlas lifted his head immediately at the tension shift in Mason's breathing. Claire noticed the dog, too. Your father used to say that Shepard saved your life overseas. Mason looked down at Atlas. More than once, the dog rested his scarred muzzle across Mason's boot, like he already knew the conversation mattered. Outside the hospital window, snow kept falling over Missoula, and somewhere beneath Dead Horse Ridge, warm water continued moving through darkness exactly the way Walter Reed said it would. Mason checked out of Providence St. Patrick Hospital at 4:26 p.m., with one arm in a reinforced sling, a paper pharmacy bag, and a bill folded twice inside his coat pocket like something sharp. Atlas walked beside him through the parking garage ramp without pulling once. The dog kept glancing at every passing stranger, still working security. The Silverado started rough in the cold, engine ticking uneven for nearly 15 seconds, before settling into a low vibration Mason could feel through the steering wheel. Claire Holloway stood near the hospital entrance, watching them leave, not smiling, just thinking. Snowflakes drifted through the yellow glow above the emergency entrance while ambulances moved in and out beneath the awning. Somewhere inside the building, a trauma alarm began sounding briefly before cutting off again. Mason drove north through downtown Missoula, with the heater barely functioning, and Atlas stretched across the passenger seat. Orange Street Food Farm passed slowly on the left, Christmas lights already hanging across storefront windows even though Thanksgiving still sat weeks away. Montana winters moved fast. Dark came early, too. By 5:11 p.m., Mason parked beside a laundromat off West Broadway and used the last $43 cash in his wallet for fuel, canned soup, dog food, and antibiotics for Atlas's stitched side wound. The cashier, a woman with silver hair and thick reading glasses, rang up the total without looking up. $58.42. Mason removed 2 cans quietly and handed them back. Atlas noticed immediately. The dog nudged one can gently with his nose from the counter edge before sitting down beside Mason's leg. The cashier finally looked at them. Long pause. Then she slid the second can back into the bag without another word. Receipt printed at 5:19 p.m. Some kindness still existed in places people stopped noticing. The drive back toward Lolo National Forest felt longer this time. Snow kept thickening over Highway 93 while logging trucks hissed past through gray slush. Mason drove mostly one-handed while his other arm stayed locked stiff inside the sling. Twice he caught himself checking mirrors too often. Too alert, too wired. Afghanistan used to feel like this before convoy ambushes, quiet roads, bad weather. That feeling in your ribs you couldn't explain. Atlas suddenly lifted his head near mile marker 24, ears forward. Mason noticed headlights parked far ahead near the ridge access road. No movement, no hazard lights, just waiting. He slowed naturally without touching the brakes hard enough to flash. Observation first. The vehicle sat half-hidden behind snow-covered brush near the entrance trail. Black pickup, lift kit, temporary construction permit sticker inside the windshield. Mason drove past without turning his head. Atlas watched the truck until it disappeared behind them. Then the dog gave one low sound in his throat. Not barking. Recognition. "Yeah," Mason muttered quietly. "I saw him, too." He drove another half-mile before cutting headlights briefly and pulling onto an abandoned logging turnout. Cold air flooded the cab instantly. Mason opened the glove box and removed compact binoculars wrapped inside an old Ranger sock. Still there, still useful. He climbed carefully onto the truck bed, despite the shoulder pain, while Atlas stayed below, scanning the trees. Snow drifted across the ridgeline under fading daylight as Mason focused the binoculars back toward the access road. Two men now, one standing near the truck, another carrying equipment cases toward the ridge trail, metallic silver, drilling gear. Mason lowered the binoculars slowly. "They're moving tonight." Atlas stared toward the ridge, waiting. The old Ranger reflex came back fast after that. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just automatic. Mason backed the Silverado deeper into the turnout, behind fallen timber, where headlights wouldn't reflect off the road. Then he checked supplies carefully beneath the tarp in the truck bed. Flashlights, rope, bolt cutters, handheld radio dead from cold, one remaining flare. Walter's revolver, he loaded it quietly. 6 rounds. Atlas watched every movement without blinking. At 6:42 p.m., they started climbing Dead Horse Ridge through timber west of the main trail instead of using the access road. Mason kept low automatically whenever headlights moved below through the snow. Old habits again. Spacing, silence, avoid silhouette exposure. The mountain looked different now. Hostile. The storm had buried most tracks from earlier days, but fresh tire grooves still scarred the lower ridge near the basalt opening. Somebody had already cleared snow away from the collapse zone using portable equipment. Too organized for curiosity. Too expensive for trespassing kids. Atlas froze suddenly near a cluster of bent pines. Mason crouched immediately beside him. Voices, faint, coming from upslope. County hearing, "Won't matter if we prove flow volume first." Branner said, "Nobody's living up here now." Wind swallowed the rest. Mason moved closer, through the trees until he could finally see them. 3 men total. Portable generator. Core drilling rig mounted on sled tracks. Flood lamps aimed toward the ridge fracture. Black Pine Development logos across jackets. One worker smoked while another adjusted tubing near the drilling head. Snow whipped sideways through the artificial light beams, making the entire ridge look like a war zone at night. Atlas's fur rose slowly along his neck. Mason studied the terrain automatically. Entry routes, exit routes, unstable surfaces. Then he saw the drill placement. Wrong spot. Very wrong. The fracture line beneath the rig connected directly above the thermal chamber. If they punched too deep through weakened basalt. Mason moved before finishing the thought. Fast. He stepped from the tree line, holding the flashlight high enough to blind the nearest worker. "Shut it down." The men spun instantly. One cursed loudly. Another reached toward his coat before freezing when Atlas appeared beside Mason with teeth exposed under the storm lights. The dog didn't bark, didn't need to. "What the hell?" the smoker snapped. "That ground's unstable," Mason barked back. "You keep drilling there and the whole shelf could collapse." The foreman stepped forward wearing insulated overalls and a beard stiff with snow. "We've got authorization." "No, you don't. County preliminary permit. For surveys." Mason said. Not drilling. The man hesitated half a second. Enough. Mason saw it immediately. Lying. The generator continued, rattling loudly behind them while drill vibration traveled faintly beneath Mason's boots through the ridge itself. He could feel it. Mountain shifting. Atlas heard it too. The shepherd suddenly snapped his head toward the fracture line and growled hard. Low. Urgent. Mason turned instantly. A crack echoed sharply somewhere beneath the snowpack. Then another. Everybody heard that one. The foreman's face changed immediately. Kill the rig, Mason shouted. One worker ran toward the controls while another slipped hard on ice near the drill platform. Snow and loose rock suddenly cascaded down the fracture slope beside them with a deep grinding sound that vibrated through the mountain. Not massive, not yet, but enough. Flood lamps tilted violently as part of the drilling sled dropped nearly 2 feet sideways into shifting snow and basalt debris. One man screamed. Atlas lunged forward before Mason could stop him. The dog grabbed the fallen worker's coat sleeve and dragged him backward, seconds before another slab of basalt crashed into the exact spot where the man's leg had been trapped. Everything went still after that. Only wind. Only the generator sputtering unevenly. The workers stared at Atlas like they'd just watched something impossible. Maybe they had. Mason stepped carefully toward the fracture line and aimed his flashlight downward. Fresh cracks now spread beneath the drilling platform, exactly where Walter's maps showed unstable thermal channels running below the surface. One more hour of drilling and the entire chamber ceiling might have collapsed, including the second reservoir, including anyone inside it. The foreman looked pale now. We didn't know. You didn't ask. Mason cut him off. The man swallowed hard. Snow kept blowing across the ridge while Atlas stood between Mason and the workers like a barrier nobody wanted to test. At 8:03 p.m., county deputies finally arrived after one of the crew called emergency services, reporting a geological collapse hazard. Deputy Aaron Velasquez climbed the ridge wearing snow gaiters and carrying a clipboard inside her jacket. She looked exhausted before even reaching the site. What happened here? Allied drilling, Mason answered. The foreman immediately protested. We had a temporary assessment approval. For visual surveying, Mason interrupted again. Not core penetration. Deputy Velasquez looked toward the unstable fracture line and swore quietly under her breath. Then she noticed Atlas standing beside the damaged drilling sled with blood still visible around the dog's old stitches. That your shepherd? Mason nodded. He just saved your worker's leg. Nobody argued with that. The injured man sat nearby, wrapped in emergency blankets, staring silently at Atlas while paramedics checked his ankle. Deputy Velasquez eventually pulled Mason aside near the tree line. Your read? Yes. She exhaled slowly. County hearings already scheduled Thursday morning about the ridge ownership, disputes, and development rights. She glanced toward the drilling site. After tonight, trust me, things just got a whole lot uglier. Snow hit harder now, wind pushing sideways through the dark timber. Mason looked back toward the damaged fracture. The mountain had warned them first. Nobody listened again. Deputy Velasquez handed him an evidence receipt at 8:41 p.m., documenting the illegal drilling equipment seizure. Black Pine Development LLC appeared clearly across the top line. Official now. Real now. Atlas pressed against Mason's leg as another distant crack echoed somewhere deep beneath Dead Horse Ridge. Not surface rock this time. Lower, far below them. Like the mountain itself was still moving underground. And somewhere under all that stone, warm water continued, flowing through darkness toward chambers nobody fully understood yet. The county sealed Dead Horse Ridge 3 days later. Yellow barricades appeared first along the old fire road near Highway 93. Then came the warning signs bolted into frozen posts beside the access trail. Geological hazard. Authorized entry only. Most people in Missoula slowed down long enough to stare at the headlines before moving on with their lives. But not everyone. At 9:14 a.m. the following Monday, Mason sat inside Conference Room B at the Missoula County Building, wearing a denim jacket that still smelled faintly like wood smoke from the chamber fire pit. Atlas rested beside his chair under the table, ears flicking every time someone entered the room. County officials shuffled paperwork across polished wood while snowmelt dripped steadily outside the tall windows overlooking West Broadway. Cole Brenner sat near the far end of the table beside two attorneys from Helena. Still expensive coat, still polished boots, but something had changed around his eyes since the collapse. People tended to lose confidence after mountains almost buried them alive. Dr. Claire Holloway spread satellite maps and thermal imaging scans across the table, one careful sheet at a time. Several pages carried University of Montana headers along the top margins beside geological survey data and handwritten notes. Mason noticed coffee stains on one corner. Real work, not presentation theater. The aquifer system beneath Dead Horse Ridge appears to be far older than previously documented, Claire explained calmly. Possibly connected to volcanic thermal channels extending south toward portions of the Bitterroot Valley fault structures. One commissioner blinked twice. Another simply frowned at the scans. Claire kept going. The chamber system is naturally insulated. Stable airflow, stable temperature, minimal seasonal fluctuation. Improper commercial excavation could destabilize the entire ridge. Cole's attorney leaned back slowly. With respect, Dr. Holloway, we're discussing 30 acres of private land, not Yellowstone National Park. No, Claire answered. You're discussing a geological structure nobody fully understands yet. Silence followed that. Good silence. Atlas shifted slightly beneath the table and rested his scarred muzzle against Mason's boot. The dog still moved slower since the ridge collapse. His stitched side wound had healed, but cold mornings made him favor the rear leg for the first few steps each day. 8 years old now, combat dogs aged fast. Mason kept one hand resting lightly against Atlas's neck, while county officials argued over environmental liability, access rights, FEMA classifications, and emergency use preservation statutes. Words. Always words. He'd heard enough briefing rooms in his life to know most people talked longer when they were scared of responsibility. At 10:42 a.m., Commissioner Dale Vickers finally turned toward Mason directly. You've spent more time inside that ridge than anyone alive now except maybe your father, he said. What exactly do you want done with it? Mason looked down briefly at Walter Reed's old notebook, resting beside him on the table. The leather edges had cracked deeper over winter, still holding together. Ain't mine alone anymore, Mason answered quietly. Several people looked confused. He continued. That water system could help people someday. Emergency shelter, too. He paused once. But if people rush it, they'll destroy it. Cole scoffed softly under his breath. Mason ignored him. I don't want tourists tearing it apart for pictures. His fingers rested against the notebook cover. But I also don't think it should stay buried forever. Claire nodded once without speaking. The commissioners exchanged glances. Then Dale Vickers leaned back slowly and rubbed his jaw. What about controlled access? Mason looked toward the window, where gray clouds drifted low over Missoula. Then toward Atlas. The dog watched him carefully, like always. Waiting for the decision, too. Educational only, Mason finally said. Smalls groups, supervised. Another pause. Veterans, maybe. That changed the room, not dramatically, just enough. Cole's attorneys immediately shifted strategy after that. Less aggressive, more cautious. Nobody wanted to publicly oppose a veteran therapeutic program connected to a protected environmental site, especially after local news stations began covering Atlas saving one of the drill workers during the collapse. People loved the dog. By February, the county approved provisional preservation status for Dead Horse Ridge under environmental protection review. Limited structural reinforcement could continue under university oversight. No resort construction, no drilling. Black pine development quietly disappeared from the conversation after that. Money moved on when mountains became complicated. Mason returned to the ridge, full-time once snow began breaking apart across the slopes. The first thaw came slowly through western Montana that year. Thin streams of meltwater ran beneath ice shelves, while fog drifted through the pine trees near dawn. The mountain sounded different now. Breathing again. Atlas moved ahead along the ridge trails each morning, checking perimeter instinctively before Mason carried equipment down into the main chamber. Some habits never retired, neither did some scars. At 6:08 a.m. one morning, a National Guard helicopter crossed low over the valley, heading east toward Butte. The rotor sound hit Mason before he fully woke, instantly upright, heart hammering. Hand already reaching toward the flashlight beside the cot before his brain caught up with the present. Atlas climbed onto the cot immediately and shoved his muzzle hard beneath Mason's arm. Pressure grounding. Training. The dog stayed there until the helicopter noise faded completely. Then silence returned to the chamber except for flowing water and Mason's uneven breathing. Another morning survived. Construction work began carefully after that. No shortcuts. County engineers installed reinforced anchors along the safer entry corridor while university geology students mapped airflow routes using handheld sensors and laser scanners. Mason supervised every inch of it personally, with one working shoulder and a notebook full of Walter's measurements tucked into his jacket pocket. He trusted data more than optimism. The first legal structure built above ground wasn't large, just a cabin. 12 by 18 feet near the lower access trail overlooking Bitterroot Valley. Cedar siding, tin roof, wood stove salvaged from a demolition site outside Stevensville. Mason built most of it himself, slowly, one-handed at first. Atlas slept nearby through nearly every hammer strike. By April, Veterans Outreach Montana contacted Mason after hearing about the thermal chamber from Claire Holloway's university reports. The organization operated small PTSD recovery programs for former military members struggling with housing instability and post-deployment trauma. Quiet programs, not publicity events. A former Marine named Greg Fulton visited first, early 50s, walked with a brace on his left knee, and flinched every time trucks backfired along the highway. He stayed inside the chamber nearly 40 minutes without speaking, just listening to the water. When he finally climbed back out into daylight, he stood near the ridge edge, staring over the valley for a long time before speaking. "First place I slept through a full night in 7 years," he muttered. That mattered more to Mason than any county approval ever could. Word spread carefully after that, not viral, not flashy, real. A few veterans at a time visited Dead Horse Ridge through controlled retreat weekends coordinated quietly through outreach groups around Missoula and Hamilton. No cameras allowed. No social media promotion. Just coffee. Silence. Firewood, breathing room. Atlas became part of the process without anyone officially deciding it. Some veterans talked easier while petting the old shepherd beside the chamber spring. Others simply sat near him in silence while he leaned quietly against their legs, like he understood exactly why they came there. Maybe he did. Combat leaves a smell behind sometimes. Dogs remember smells. By early May, snow finally disappeared from the southern slopes. Bitterroot wildflowers began pushing through gravel beside the access road, while warmer winds rolled across the ridge instead of blizzards. Life returning. At 7:22 p.m., one evening, Mason stood outside the cabin, sanding rough cedar boards, when a familiar truck pulled slowly up the trail. Travis Reed climbed out, wearing work gloves and an old ranch coat stained with hay dust. First time he'd been there since the will reading. Atlas watched him carefully from beside the cabin steps, but didn't growl. Interesting. Travis removed his hat awkwardly while staring toward the ridge opening. Claire gave me directions, he said. Mason nodded once. No handshake. Not yet. Wind moved softly through the pines around them, while evening sunlight spread gold across the Bitterroot Valley below. Somewhere farther down the slope, snowmelt water clicked quietly against basalt stone. Travis looked older now, too. Ranch life did that. I heard what happened with the drilling crew, he muttered. County people been talking. Mason kept sanding the cedar board another few seconds before setting it aside. Mountain almost came down. Travis nodded slowly, then glanced toward Atlas. That dog really drag a guy out? Yep. Another silence. The Kind brothers carried for years because nobody taught them how to cross it. Finally, Travis looked toward the ridge entrance again. You gonna show me? Mason studied him a long moment, then picked up a lantern. Watch your footing. The descent into the chamber took Travis longer than most people. Ranch hands worked hard, but underground spaces bothered people differently, especially men used to open land. Atlas led the way carefully down the reinforced passage, while lantern light flickered across black basalt walls damp with mineral runoff. Then the chamber opened beneath them. Warm air, running water, stone breathing softly in the dark. Travis stopped halfway across the lower platform, didn't speak, didn't move. He simply stared upward toward the vaulted basalt ceiling, while water moved steadily through the underground channels below. The mountain spoke for itself now. Eventually, Travis walked toward Walter Reed's notebook resting inside the small protective case near the wall. He opened it carefully with rough ranch fingers and stared at their father's handwriting for a long time. Atlas lay down beside the spring pool nearby with his head resting across his paws, watching everything. Finally, Travis exhaled through his nose. He knew, he murmured. Mason leaned lightly against the stone wall. Yeah, he always knew. Neither man said more than that for a while. Didn't need to. The chamber carried enough silence already. When they climbed back to the surface, nearly an hour later, sunset had turned the valley copper red beneath the clouds. Wind crossed Dead Horse Ridge exactly the same way it had the day Mason first arrived there sleeping out of his Silverado. But the place felt different now, not empty anymore, useful. Travis stood beside the truck before leaving and rubbed one hand across his beard slowly. You staying up here tonight? Mason looked toward the cabin porch where Atlas already waited beside the door. Yeah. Travis nodded once. Then, after a pause long enough to matter, he reached into the truck bed and lifted out a weathered wooden toolbox. Dad's old framing tools, he said quietly. Figured maybe they belong here. Mason took the box without speaking. The metal latches rattled softly in the wind. Travis climbed back into his truck after that and drove down the ridge road without another word. No apology. None needed. Sometimes men raised around hard country only knew how to say things sideways. Mason carried the toolbox into the cabin after dark. Inside sat Walter Reed's old hammer, measuring square and carpenter pencils worn nearly flat with age. Still sharp. Atlas circled twice beside the wood stove before settling down heavily near the door. Outside, wind moved steadily across Dead Horse Ridge, while stars appeared one at a time above the dark Montana timber. At 11:48 p.m., Mason woke briefly from another deployment dream. But this time he didn't sit upright gasping for exits, didn't reach for his weapon. He only listened. Water moving below, wind above, Atlas breathing steadily beside the stove. Then he closed his eyes again and went back to sleep. Morning arrived quietly over Dead Horse Ridge. No alarms, no helicopters, no freezing panic ripping him awake before sunrise. Just wind moving through pine branches above the cabin roof and the soft crack of the wood stove settling as embers cooled. At 6:31 a.m., Mason opened his eyes to pale gold light slipping through the small cabin window facing Bitterroot Valley. Atlas still slept beside the stove with his chin resting across Walter Reed's old tool belt. The shepherd's muzzle had gone whiter over the winter. Mason noticed that more lately. Time marked dogs faster than men. He sat up slowly on the edge of the cot while the ridge stayed quiet around them. Somewhere below the cabin floor, hidden beneath basalt and thermal stone, water continued moving through the mountain exactly as it had long before roads, counties, or property lines existed. Steady, patient, unimpressed by people. Atlas lifted his head once Mason's boots touched the floorboards. Tail thump, that was enough greeting. Outside, spring had finally reached western Montana for real. Snow remained only in narrow shadows along the northern slopes, while green spread slowly back across the lower valleys. The air carried wet cedar, cold stone, and distant river water drifting up from somewhere beyond Highway 93. Mason stepped onto the porch, holding a chipped enamel coffee mug at 6:48 a.m. Steam curled upward into the mountain air. Below him sat the reinforced access trail, leading toward the chamber entrance. Small solar path lights now lined sections of the route for guided evening descents. Near the trailhead stood the cedar sign he'd carved by hand 3 nights earlier. Some places only open for people willing to stay. The lettering wasn't perfect, neither was the man who carved it. A pickup truck appeared on the lower access road around 8:02 a.m., tires crunching slowly over loose gravel. Mason recognized the vehicle immediately. Howard Kemp. The old attorney climbed out, wearing a brown canvas jacket and carrying a paper sack from Clyde Coffee downtown. He looked older than he had during the will, reading months earlier. Less polished, too. More human. Figured coffee tastes better up here, Howard said while handing over the sack. Mason glanced inside. 2 breakfast burritos, 1 black coffee, 1 small container of bacon for Atlas. The old lawyer noticed Mason looking at him. "What?" He shrugged lightly. "Dog earned it." Atlas accepted the bacon carefully from Howard's hand without taking his eyes off him once. Still screening strangers. Howard stood beside Mason on the porch, while morning sunlight spread slowly across Bitterroot Valley below them. "You know," Howard said after a while, "your father came to my office the week before he died." Mason stayed quiet, Howard continued. He already knew Travis would get the ranch. Small pause. Knew Cole would chase money no matter what happened. Wind moved softly across the ridge. But he spent almost 2 hours talking about you. That landed heavier than the coffee cup in Mason's hand. Howard looked toward the chamber trail. He said you were the only one who understood the difference between owning land and surviving it. Neither man spoke after that for a while. Didn't need to. Around noon, the first veteran retreat group of the spring arrived in 2 dusty SUVs, coordinated through Veterans Outreach Montana. 4 men, 1 woman. Mostly quiet people carrying backpacks too small for vacations and eyes too tired for tourism. Atlas met them at the trailhead, calmly, professional. A former Navy corpsman named Elena Ruiz paused halfway down the access trail and rested one hand against the basalt wall as warm air drifted upward around them. "You can feel the temperature change," she whispered. Mason nodded once. Mountain breathes different underground. Inside the chamber, conversation stayed sparse at first. People sat near the spring water or walked slowly beneath the vaulted basalt ceiling while lantern light reflected softly across mineral walls. No phones out, no forced sharing circles, no speeches, just space. By late afternoon, voices came easier. A former infantryman from Billings talked quietly about not sleeping indoors anymore after 2 deployments near Fallujah. Another veteran admitted he still parked facing exits everywhere he went. Mason didn't interrupt them, didn't therapize them either. He only listened while Atlas moved between people, like he understood exactly who needed contact and who needed distance. At 4:47 p.m., Elena sat near the spring pool, brushing one hand through Atlas's fur while staring at the flowing water. "He does this on purpose," she said softly. Mason looked over. Atlas had leaned fully against her leg, grounding pressure again. The same thing he used to do for Mason after nightmares. He was trained to interrupt panic responses, Mason explained quietly. Elena swallowed once and nodded without speaking further. Some wounds recognized each other immediately. By early summer, Dead Horse Ridge changed it again. Not commercially, not loudly, naturally. University of Montana geology students rotated through twice a month, documenting mineral stability and underground airflow changes. Veterans Outreach expanded retreats carefully after county approval. Small guided educational tours continued under strict limits. 8 people maximum. No unsupervised entry. No drilling. No touching the lower thermal channels. The ridge had rules now. Good ones. Mason kept building too. A second small cabin appeared near the tree line by July. Then a covered firewood rack. Then benches overlooking the valley where veterans often sat silently after chamber visits, watching sunset spread over western Montana. Nothing fancy, just useful. One evening near the end of August, Mason drove into Missoula for supply runs. Atlas rode beside him through downtown, while summer tourists crowded sidewalks near Caras Park and food trucks lined the riverfront. Life moving normally again. At 7:13 p.m., Mason stopped outside the veterans' food pantry Walter Reed had secretly donated to for years. The building looked smaller than he remembered from winter. Older, too. He carried 2 storage bins inside without announcing himself. Canned goods, medical supplies, blankets. A volunteer named Denise recognized him immediately. "You're the Ridge guy." Mason almost smiled at that. Almost. Before leaving, he quietly handed her an envelope containing a cashier's check for 8,000 thousands from the retreat program donations. "No name attached," he said. Denise looked down at the check, then back up at him. "Your father used to say the exact same thing." Mason froze half a second. Small thing, hard thing. Denise softened immediately after noticing it. He'd leave envelopes under the office door sometimes. She smiled faintly. Always before sunrise. Mason nodded once, then left before the conversation got heavier. That night, he and Atlas climbed back toward Dead Horse Ridge, beneath a sky full of late summer stars. The Silverado rattled harder now over rough roads, transmission slipping occasionally on steep grades. Still climbing, though, like them. At 9:42 p.m., Mason parked near the cabin and shut off the engine. Crickets filled the darkness below the ridge, while cool wind rolled softly through the pines. Atlas climbed out slower than he once had. Stiff rear leg. Mason waited automatically. The old shepherd reached the porch eventually, and settled near the doorway, facing outward toward the trail. Guard position. Always. Mason sat beside him with Walter Reed's notebook resting open across his knee. Lantern light flickered softly across the final page, while the mountain breathed beneath them. Most men only see what the sun touches. Walter's handwriting remained steady even after all these years. Mason looked out across the valley below. The ranch Travis inherited sat somewhere far beyond those dark hills. Missoula glowed faintly in the distance. Highway 93 cut through the night like a pale ribbon, carrying strangers north and south, without any idea what rested beneath the mountains around them. Dead Horse Ridge never became famous. That mattered. No luxury resort ever touched the basalt slopes. No advertisements pointed tourists toward hidden thermal chambers beneath the mountain. The county eventually protected the aquifer under conservation status, with educational exemptions attached. Exactly enough attention. Nothing more. And slowly, over time, people began arriving there not because they wanted entertainment, but because they needed quiet. Veterans mostly. Widowers sometimes. Men and women who carried invisible things too heavy for crowded places. The ridge held them without asking questions, just like it held Mason. Near midnight, wind moved stronger across the porch while Atlas rested his head against Mason's boot. The old shepherd's eyes stayed fixed toward the dark trail beyond the cabin, still watching perimeter, still protecting home. Mason reached down and rubbed gently behind the scarred left ear Atlas had carried since deployment years ago. "Good work, buddy," he murmured quietly. Atlas closed his eyes. Below them, warm spring water continued flowing through darkness beneath the mountain, through basalt, through old chambers, through spaces hidden deep below the surface where most people would never think to look. Walter Reed had understood something before he died. The world often called difficult places worthless simply because they demanded patience. Dead Horse Ridge never promised comfort. It offered purpose, and sometimes purpose was the only thing strong enough to pull a man back from the edge. The wind crossed the ridge one last time that night, bending pine branches softly against the stars while lantern light glowed warm inside the cabin windows. Then even the mountain grew quiet. Maybe that was the real secret hidden beneath Dead Horse Ridge. Not the water, not the chambers, not even the land itself. It was the simple truth that some people spend their whole lives being misunderstood because the world only notices what stands in the sunlight. The loud ones, the successful ones, the people who look whole from a distance, but deep places tell different stories. A scarred dog still guarding the door long after the war ended. An old notebook filled with quiet acts of kindness nobody ever saw. A man sleeping peacefully for the first time in years because he finally found a place that asked him to stay instead of leave. That matters. Communities don't become stronger by hiding broken people away. They become stronger when someone finally sits beside them long enough to understand what they carried home. And sometimes the people the world calls damaged are the very ones holding everything together underneath. Like stone beneath a mountain. If this story made you believe that every person deserves to be seen with dignity, comment 1 below. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe and stay with us for the next one.